Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Icarus, and we are also back to chapter 13 of Whipping Girl. It is titled Self-Deception, and I thought we would have a fun time today by having a little reading session. The chapter is literally 2 pages long, so it's not going to be that much. And I thought it would be a good way for y'all to get a taste of her writing style if you're following this along without actually having read the book yourself. Which, I don't blame you, considering everything. Yeah. And before I get in, my usual disclaimers. This book was written in 2005, published in 2007. Therefore, some of the terminology that might come up is out of date compared to today's standards. And if you hear Dory meowing, it's because she is needy and the upstairs is her domain. So she's like, hey, pay attention to me. And finally, new laptop. Give me sticker suggestions because I feel naked. And this is going with me to school. So, like I said, chapter 13 is titled Self-Deception. And it starts in 2002. Teenager Gwen Arugio was brutally murdered by 4 men who bludgeoned her to death because she was born male, because she was a transgender woman. But this is not another piece about the horrors of hate crimes or another desperate rant about violence, ignorance, or prejudice. No, this piece is about the myth of deception. A year and a half after her death, 3 of Gwen's murderers stood on trial together. The evidence demonstrated that they had plotted her murder a week in advance. And normally, premeditation ensures a first-degree murder sentence, but not in this case. The trial ended in a hung jury, a victory for the defense lawyers, who insisted that the murder was merely manslaughter because the defendants were somehow victims of Gwen's sexual deceit. 2 of the killers had been intimate with her, and their lawyers argued that when they later discovered that she had male genitals, they were driven to commit a crime of passion. Deception, it's the noose that the narcissistic drape around the necks of transgender women. Lesbian feminist Janice Raymond uses the word deception over and over again in the transsexual empire as a way to dismiss transsexual women's fantasies so that she could call them men and accuse them of transitioning in order to penetrate women's spaces. There's a ... there, but we're not going to get into the footnotes. We know Janice Raymond is a moron. And rape women's bodies. And scientists who study animal mating behavior often use the word deception to explain why the males of many species engage in courtship rituals with feminine males, creatures that the researchers dismiss as female mimics to deny any possibility that the masculine males willingly choose to partner with feminine males. Behind every accusation of deception lies an unchallenged assumption, in this case, that no male in his right mind could ever be attracted to someone who is feminine, yet physically male. This premise underlies Jay Leno's infamous question to Hugh Grant, "What were you thinking?" It's why Grant and fellow celebrity Eddie Murphy are still able to star in films for Disney, while the trainee prostitutes they sought out are reduced to cinematic novelties. Tasteless jokes in teen comedies, Bad Lou Reed anecdotes in art films produced by Andy Warhol wannabes, or as examples of urban decay in police drama set on sordid and seedy city streets. Transgender women are portrayed as deceivers so that the rabid heterosexuals can turn a blind eye to the transsexual porn ads that litter the back of men's magazines like Hustler and Penthouse, so that the mainstream moviegoers can watch The Crying Game and act surprised to find out that the woman who performs in the drag bar happens to have a penis. Deception is the scarlet letter that trannies are made to wear so that everybody else can claim innocence. This is why the police, lawyers, and press who worked on the Gwen Arugio case ignored the multiple sources who insisted that Gwen's killers knew she was transgender to begin with. It's why nobody ever questioned how next to impossible it would be for 2 of Gwen's killers to have had anal sex with her without ever coming across her genitals. Nobody was willing to even consider the possibility that Gwen's murderers knowingly had sex with her. Why challenge our culture's myopic view of male sexuality when it's so easy to blame it all on one deceiving tranny? And why question the psychotic paranoia with which many men defend their masculinity when it's so convenient to trash one young trans person's gender identity? The truth is that the myth of transsexual deception is merely a ruse, a smokescreen designed to hide societal complicity in this tragedy. Most people want to believe that Gwen's murder was an isolated incident, an egregious act committed by a handful of young men who were provoked into doing the unthinkable. That way, they need not confront the fact that half of the hung jury were more willing to identify with the male homophobic hysteria than with an innocent transgender teenager. They need not examine how the news coverage and commentary, articles, editorials, and analysis invariably chose to view this crime through the murderer's eyes or through a grieving mother's tears, for fear of what might happen if they dared to imagine themselves as Gwen, a young tranny they so desperately wanted to believe was nothing like them. Everyone chose to tiptoe around the subject because they were too afraid to put themselves in Gwen Arugio's shoes, if only for a moment, to ask what the world looked like from her view, to imagine how frustrated you might be if you were unable to explore your own sexuality without having other people turn your body into a lightning rod for their own insecurities, to imagine how unjust it would feel to be dismissed as a fraud despite being the only 19-year-old in your known universe with the guts to truly be yourself, to imagine how frail masculinity would seem to you if you had seen a pack of young men in their 20s exude pure fear over one feminine transgender teen, to imagine how flat-out foolish those boys must have seemed as they confronted you with the question, "Are you a woman or a man?" And to picture the blank stares on their faces when you replied, "Isn't it obvious?" To imagine how hollow accusations of deception would sound to you if you understood the real question that needed to be asked was, who's deceiving whom? As I said, this piece is not about hate crimes, violence, ignorance, or prejudice. It's about self-deception. It's about the assumptions that people like me live with on a daily basis. Because like Gwen, I was born male. I am a transgender woman. And if we were to meet, and if I didn't immediately share that information with you, would that be an act of deception? Could you accuse me of telling a lie if you were to see what you wanted to see with your own eyes, and I decided to simply keep quiet? And if I were to presume things about you that were not true, could I accuse you of misleading me too? Or would such a careless assumption of deception merely be expressions of callous pride, a stubborn refusal to acknowledge our own mistaken assumptions? The untold story behind Gwen's much-publicized death is that she is only the tip of the iceberg. Gwen's murder took place in San Francisco Bay, where there are thousands of people who identify as transgender. Keep that in mind every time you walk down the street or flirt with a stranger. A certain percentage of people you meet either appear to be a sex different from the one they were assigned at birth, or identify as a gender different from the one you assume they are. And if this makes you feel uneasy, it is only because you are choosing not to live in reality. It is time to move beyond pseudo-liberal sound bites about how we all need to accept people who differ from us. Mere tolerance is insufficient. If we are to learn any lesson from Gwen Arugio's death, it's that we each need to take personal responsibility for our own presumptions. We should stop buying into the myth of deception, because the truth is that every day, each of us is guilty of committing countless acts of assumption. So that was chapter 13, and I will disclaim, I agree with pretty much everything that she says in this. I wanted to read this chapter for a few reasons. The first being it's very short. The second being there's a few things I have to quibble about in what she's saying, but overall I agree that the gay panic defense, the trans panic defense, those are they should have never been tolerated to begin with. And it also highlights something that I have my suspicions about that I haven't quite confirmed yet, with the book potentially being originally maybe a series of essays or blog posts that she then sort of edited together into this book. Because if you paid attention to chapter 13, we have already talked about how the idea of deception and transgender, specifically trans women, people being deceivers. We talked about that very early on, within like the first couple of chapters. So why is it coming up again in a chapter that has literally no connection to any other chapter, and it sort of reintroduces concepts and things that we have seen before, like Janice Raymond, and I will be surprised if it connects to the later chapters at all, unless Miss Arugio is brought up in the abstract. The things I have quibbles about, it's mostly really just some of her language. So I've been listening to Jane Austen's Persuasion recently, and if you're familiar Jane Austen's writing, she is much more direct than other people that were publishing in her time period, much more straightforward, but still had a sort of language that would emphasize points and draw a reader in. And I hesitate to say flowery because, again, she's much more direct, but a more expansive way of describing things. And despite the fact that these are written in two completely different eras, two completely different genres, by two completely different people, a lot of what I see in Julia Serrano's writing is sort of the same. It's very direct, but there is sort of an expansion in how she writes that makes things more colorful, brings more emphasis, tries to highlight her intelligence with the language that she's using without necessarily speaking down to the reader. Unless you're a trans man reading this in the year 2022, like I am, then I feel very highly spoken down to. But that's neither here nor there. So that's something I've noticed, and it comes to the forefront when she's describing Miss Arugio's mindset. Serrano sort of fabricates what she imagines Miss Arugio going through as a young trans person. And I don't totally hate it, except some of the stuff that she talks about is almost, I don't know the right word, but where she's talking about Miss Arugio being the only person she knows living as her authentic self, that sort of thing, is very dismissive of the people that she was around, Miss Arugio's friends and family. And I can understand where Serrano is coming from, because we're talking about a tragic death where the murderers got away with it because of cisgender transphobia and cisgender panic and the idea that transgender women are less than. But if I'm right in my theory that this was originally an essay she published online, or maybe in a newspaper or wherever, and then she brought it into the book, I wish she had taken her time to perhaps edit and reflect on things after the time that she spent, because again, the murder happened in 2002. Very likely this was written very shortly thereafter, so she would have had a bit of a cooling off period to think about it. And I'll be speaking about nuance a lot later in my next video. It's going to be a response video, but don't worry about that right now. I also would like to note that she uses the word tranny when she's talking specifically about trans women. We know she's not being inclusive of trans men, because this is entirely focused on how trans women are treated. She has shown in previous chapters that she does not care about trans men and does not care and thinks that trans men have some sort of privilege and an easier time passing and transitioning, that sort of thing. So when she's saying tranny, she's meaning trans women, and ignoring the fact that that slur has been used across the board for anybody who comes across as trans. So that's another thing I noticed and have a quibble with. Another thing would be the anthropomorphification of animal species that have feminine male genders. Sorry, I'm just like, all I can think about is the birds. There's like some birds that will have the male, the female, and then a male that mimics the female, how they look to mate with the more masculine males. And the way that Serrano is talking about it is putting very human thought processes behind something that is just the way the genetics are being expressed in these animals. We're not talking about a female lion who is acting like a male lion and ends up growing a mane or something like that. That's something that's happened, and even that example isn't a good example because we're still talking about some level of genetics. These animals aren't physically transitioning like a person like you or me would be doing. So the decrying scientists for having language around how like three gendered birds or that sort of thing will have mating rituals and mimic and deceive and whatever, that language that she's decrying scientists for using. She's a molecular biologist. People have used her background in science as a way to say she is bringing a unique perspective. Oh, there's hair everywhere, Dory. A unique perspective to her work, but she's also saying this shit, and it's like, okay. My final quibble would be when she brings up Hugh Grant and Eddie Murphy. And I don't know about Hugh Grant, but I know Eddie Murphy, shortly after The Nutty Professor came out, he was pulled over by the cops and had a trans prostitute with him. And he claimed that he was giving her a ride home. Of course, we know what's going on. His wife and kids were out at the time, that sort of thing. And the prostitute ended up getting arrested because she had a warrant. When she brings up that Hugh Grant and Eddie Murphy are able to continue to star in Disney films while the trans prostitutes are condemned to other things, I do know where she's coming from. She's trying to point out that these trans women aren't allowed to have starring roles and be depicted in a positive manner. But because we are looking at this from the perspective of talking about a group of cis men murdering a young trans girl, it almost sounds like it can come across, I would say, that she's wishing Eddie Murphy and Hugh Grant would get punished in the way that she and hopefully most decent people in the world wish that these men had been punished, should have been punished. But those are my quibblings. That's all I have, because everything else is like, yeah, no, this is wrong. The idea of the panic defense is incredibly stupid. The fact that these people were premeditating the murder, that's not panic. Panic is when you see someone coming at you and they get too close and they start to say something and it's dark and you're scared, and so you punch them because you're like, get the fuck away from me. I still wouldn't recommend doing it. But that's more justifiable panic. Or going into a haunted house and getting startled and turning around and just slapping the shit out of the performer because, again, not something you should do. It's not a defense, but that is an explanation. Anyway, yeah, let me know what you think of how Serrano writes, because reading it out loud really puts into perspective to me how her writing comes across, to me at least. And I want to know what you guys think. Is it very persuasive for you? Does she lose some of that fiery charge knowing what we have been reading through the previous chapters to this point? Or does it still pack a punch? Because I know for me, the punch has been diminished. It brings back some of the, hell yeah, you're right about this, this is wrong, but it's not nearly as strong as if I had read it in total isolation, if that makes sense. But yeah, uh, news for everything else, like I said, new laptop, so we'll see how I do with editing on whatever software is on my new laptop until one day I can afford buying some more professional editing software. I have done some of my rebranding. The YouTube channel is now a Happy Sad Yo-Yo, which is what I am on Tumblr and Twitter. I also included some links to my Tumblr and Twitter in the About section. There's 132 of you right now. We're currently vacillating between 131 and 132, but that's really exciting. That's more people than I know IRL. And I think that's about it. I thank y'all for watching. Again, let me know how actually hearing the words fully in context with each other, how that affects your perception of her writing thus far. Because I'm really curious. And yeah, other than that, you guys have a great day. I will talk to you later after I make a script, because I'm going to need it. Alright, bye.